Welt Yang. To many, he's a man filled with much mysteries, especially with his past, and some, if not most of you, may already know that he comes from the world of Honkai Impact 3rd. However, trying to get the relevant information about his said backstory is, well, overwhelming. And I can totally agree with you. Trying to even begin this script seemed almost impossible, but that didn't stop me from trying. And thanks to some pretty helpful sources that I will leave in the description below, I can confidently introduce to you the story of the Herrscher of Reason, Welt Yang.
Can't sleep? I understand.
Welt Yang, originally born on Honkai Impact 3rd's version of Earth, is the son of Elias Nokaviatin, his father, and Henrietta Yang, his mother. And if you're wondering if Welt is his actual name, then you'd be mistaken. Welt Yang's real birth name is Joachim Nokaviatin. As to why his name is drastically different, we must focus on another key member of Joachim's story. Berlin, January 1st, 1952. A man with blue hair and no memory to claim as his killed over 300,000 people. This was when the first Herrscher of the current era was born, the Herrscher of Reason. But before we continue with this mysterious person's story, you should have an understanding of what Honkai and Herrschers are. From what I could understand, Honkai is not one singular being, but a phenomenon coming in all sorts of disastrous forms, like Honkai Beast, Honkai Sickness, Herrschers, etc. Their strength seems to be tied with how advanced a civilization can get, hence why the previous era of Honkai Impact 3rd was destroyed, since it was the more advanced civilization compared to the now current era. And Herrschers are beings that are considered apostles of the Honkai, which are able to inhabit human vessels that can adapt to them. Herrschers are also able to control Honkai beasts, zombies, and are able to bend worldly laws to their whim. These Herrschers are born out of their host's negative emotion and are powered by a Herrscher's core. These cores are basically essential to their existence. They are also able to transfer this core from host to host if the original vessel is destroyed. While a Herrscher's main goal is to destroy the civilization, there are times where the host can conquer the will of said Honkai or become allies with the Herrscher and use their powers for good. Now that we have a basic level of understanding as to what Honkai and Herrschers are, let's get back to our mysterious blue-haired Herrscher. The blue-haired man, who we know later as Welt Joyce, didn't exist during the creation of the first Herrscher. Instead, was created from basically nothing and was heavily influenced by the dying thoughts of a man named Carl Gustav, who was one of the 300,000 victims during that incident. And as fragments of thoughts and souls were being collected to form the Herrscher's core, Welt heard thousands of voices cry out for a savior. So, as the core formed, Welt wanted to not be a symbol of fear, but someone who can be a savior to humanity. A bit later, an organization known as Schicksal, whose main goal is to fight against the Honkai, picked him up after he collapsed from fatigue. And for the next 3 years, he was going from lab to lab being a test subject to Schicksal. And during his stay at Schicksal Labs, he was sent letters by a person codenamed Clown Alpha. In 1955, Welt was transferred to a lab in London named Lab 42, which housed 2 scientists named Legiel Albert Einstein and Dr. Federica Nikola Tesla. Einstein assured Welt that he wasn't going to be experimented on, and this is when Einstein would finally give him the name Welt Joyce. As Welt got accustomed to his new lifestyle, this is when he'd meet Elias Nokaviatin and the then young 8-year-old Joachim Nokaviatin. While I couldn't find anything solid as to the relationship between Welt and Joachim, it seems they are rather close due to future events. Elias then gives Welt a letter and leaves with Joachim. Right afterwards, a scientist named Schrödinger found an exciting game she wants to play with Einstein, and also some words in a strange language. This was when Lab 42's team, consisting of Einstein, Tesla, Welt, and Schrödinger, would head to America. Before I continue, I'd like to mention that Welt made a lot of friends along the way, and one of these friends was a Valkyrie named Reina, who works for Schicksal, basically female warriors who fight against Honkai. She will be important later on, but I decided to introduce her now for the sake of trying to keep things on point. After some time in America and certain events happening, the Lab 42 team decided to head back to London. Skipping ahead to the end of the month, Welt, Einstein, and Tesla all head to a beach resort, and later that day is when Welt would finally meet the person codenamed Clown Alpha, whose true identity is the overseer of Schicksal, Otto Apocalypse. Otto proposes to Welt to make him the successor of Schicksal by taking Welt into the Apocalypse family, and after some more talking, the electricity goes out and Welt would eventually refuse Otto's offer and leaves. The next day, Einstein, Tesla, and Welt would head back to America, where they would eventually get their hands on a very powerful weapon that was made from the Herrscher of Earth's core, the Ninth Divine Key, the Star of Eden, which would go on to become Joachim's signature weapon both later on and in Honkai Star Rail. After defeating a Honkai beast, fiddling with the Star of Eden to figure out how it works, and healing a wounded woman, they would head back to this woman's house so she could thank them for Reina healing her. But suddenly, Welt and the others heard a knocking at the door, and to everyone's surprise, it was the scientist Schrödinger, who was now a half Honkai beast. A fight breaks out within the house with only Welt left uninjured. Welt then has to make a decision, either stall Schrödinger until Reina arrives, or pick up the Star of Eden and attempt to fight the half Honkai beast. And as the thousands of voices that formed his Herrscher core starts telling him to face her head on, Reina suddenly arrives, breaking up the fight. And to Welt's surprise, this was just a stunt to help Welt awaken his Herrscher powers. However, a radio signal interrupts this convo as Edison of the North American branch of Schicksal warned Welt and the others of a potential tsunami due to her sacrificing herself to throw a huge ball of Honkai energy into the ocean. This would eventually lead to Edison dying protecting New York. As this happens, Joachim's father, Elias, arrives and spills the truth about Edison's sacrifice, saying that he sabotaged Edison's project because Otto Apocalypse threatened to harm his son. But as he revealed this truth, Otto took control of the Valkyrie Reina and stabs Elias through the chest, which sadly kills him. He then attacks and almost kills Welt, Einstein, and Tesla. However, thanks to Schrödinger, she was able to use Reina's weapon to heal all three of them. And as Welt gets back up, he picks up the Star of Eden and says, "Witness the shattering of stars," creating a black hole and destroying one of Otto's many bodies. However, before Otto was completely destroyed, he uses the power of the Void Archives, which mimics the previous era's Herrscher of Reason's core, to create the Divine Key, Ode to Judah, which uses Honkai sealing abilities to destroy the Welt Star of Eden. And as Otto was defeated, he decides to use his last resort and send a nuclear fission missile to destroy Welt and the entire city along with him. As this missile heads towards the city, the team decides that Welt's Herrscher of Reason's power is the only way to stop this missile from causing mass destruction. So without waste, Welt uses his Herrscher powers, which allows him to create anything he has knowledge on, and makes a 20-kilometer radius shield and protects the city. However, using this much of his power took a toll on his body, and as his life is fading, Joachim rushes to his side, and Welt Joyce not only transfers his Herrscher core to Joachim, but also his mission to protect this world and become a savior. And lastly, his name that represents the mission, the name of the world. It's now the year 2000, and with this year comes the birth of the second Herrscher of the current era, the Herrscher of the Void. This time, it's a little girl named Sirin, and like Welt, she was also a victim of Schicksal's experiments. However, there was no Lab 42 this time to save her from the clutches of Schicksal's experiments. And worse yet, her friends, Aphora, Agatha, and Galena all tragically died from these experiments. One by one, she watched as their life fades from this world. She begs and pleads to God to protect her from these scientists. Sadly, God didn't answer her calls. But something much worse did. Later, Schicksal's Valkyries came to investigate the disappearance of Schicksal's scientists at the lab where Sirin was being held. But so did the anti-entropy. I'm back, and before we continue, you're going to have to know who and what is the anti-entropy. To sum it up, this organization was founded a year later by Einstein and Tesla after the battle in New York, and are basically the enemies of Schicksal, with our Welt Yang, who got his first name from Welt Joyce and his last name from his mother, as their leader. leader, they also want to protect humanity and stop the Honkai. However, they don't want to use Valkyries to fend off Honkai, but decides to use mechs instead. After a scuffle between Schicksal and some Honkai beasts controlled by Sirin, Welt arrives to help out Schicksal and temporarily make an alliance to stop the second Herrscher, Sirin. Eventually, Welt figures out that Sirin can enter the imaginary space using her void powers. Welt then breaks into the imaginary void and comes face to face with Sirin. After a quick chat, Sirin begins to tell Welt that she doesn't see him as a true Herrscher, since the core was passed down to him. Their first fight begins and she's able to overpower him and trap him within the imaginary space. However, Welt quickly escapes. For their second round, Welt begins to use higher amounts of his power, creating entire armies of mechs and other sorts of weapons. While Sirin can easily defeat these, just the sheer amount Welt can casually create is enough to overpower her, even to the point where she views this as cheating. Of course, Welt denies this and calls it the ingenuity of the human race. And with saying this, he begins to shout a quote that would even bring a god to their knees. I am Welt of humanity, and I stand against you, Dark Queen, as a warrior, guardian of the human race. Law and reason, not the chaos of the void, shall prevail today. However, with Welt using this much of his power, it begins to damage him. But his main goal wasn't to defeat Sirin, but to stall her long enough so that Einstein and Tesla can use an anti-Honkai missile known as Silver Bullet. Sirin, with her powers, was able to redirect it to the earth below her. However, the blast was still powerful enough to take her down. Welt then prepares to finish the fight by using the Star of Eden. But before that happens, Auto Apocalypse intervenes and destroys Welt's fake Star of Eden. Sirin then escapes on top of her dragon due to Auto's interference to a location where she can properly seek out her revenge. The location Sirin escaped to was the far side of the moon. Covered in immense levels of Honkai energy, Sirin was able to meet who she claims as God. This proclaimed God then shows her how humanity must be destroyed. Sirin then begs God to grant her the powers to achieve its goal. And with the touch of God's finger, not only was she blessed with immense power, but 4 crystals that can be formed into pseudo-Herrschers to wreak havoc in her name. To test her new powers, she sends multiple large-scale pillars towards Earth, a scene which can only be described with this quote. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. This would be the beginning of the second Honkai War. Sirin challenges Welt to come to the moon for their final battle, and days later Welt accepts this challenge and decides to prepare the Arahato Ninja mech. Fun fact about this mech is that it was created into an anime and manga by the Anti-Entropy for fundings for Tesla's project. And on February 10th, Welt finally takes off for the moon. Arriving on the moon, Welt comes face to face yet again with Sirin. He then creates another Star of Eden and manages to get Sirin to follow him. This chase was meant to give his friend Siegfried enough time to collect moon rocks to send back to Einstein and the rest. However, she manages to catch Welt due to her void powers and is able to contain his black hole with her newly enhanced strength. While this is happening, Welt's friend Siegfried manages to collect enough samples and heads back to Earth. Sirin pays no mind to him heading back and destroys the Star of Eden, sending Welt crashing to the ground, sounding his defeat. As a final attempt, Welt decides to try and detonate his core in an attempt to take her out with a supernova explosion. This, however, fails as she still manages to extract his core, taking the power of reason for her own, reducing Welt's body to ashes. However, this would not be the end of his story. Welt had thought of a failsafe in case Sirin were to have consumed his core. He would transfer his personality directly inside of the core. You see, since the Herrscher of Reason's core is made up of the 300,000 souls that would not bend to the Herrscher's will, Welt could basically implant his own thoughts and personalities into it as well. Sirin, of course, did consume his core, and eventually Welt managed to break free from her yet again. However, she decides to break his core, leaving him yet again without a body. But thanks to his will, he was able to heal Einstein, who was heavily injured during the process of extracting the pseudo-Herrscher's core from Sirin. Siegfried then manages to keep the fragment of Welt's core safe. And after a long grueling battle between Sirin and the combined strength of Schicksal and the Anti-Entropy, Sirin would finally be defeated once and for all, sounding the end of the Second Honkai War. After the war, Siegfried manages to return the fragments of Welt's core back to the Anti-Entropy. 5 years would pass and Welt's core would finally be somewhat repaired. This would lead to Welt finally being able to create a new body for himself. Although, due to the damage he sustained in the Second Honkai War, he's now a lot weaker currently. He was told that it would take years to return to his former glory. The anti-entropy would also be forcibly taken over by a woman named Cocolia, who created clones of Welt Joyce to achieve this goal. During Cocolia's reign, Welt would go into hiding among Shixel as a history teacher in St. Freya High. While he was a history teacher at St. Freya, he would teach a part of a space engineering program in Caltech. This program would also be attended by a girl named Himiko Murata, daughter of Ryusuke Murata. You see, like her father, Himiko was always fond of space and always wanted to prove to everyone that aliens do in fact exist. As for her father, he used to work for Shixel, where his attempts to research aliens were always met with disapproval and negativity. Eventually, he would become obsessed with his dream and would eventually meet an actual alien one day. This alien would be a member of the Sugar Race, a race of aliens who have a rather small and cute appearance that can morph into monsters that are quite strong. One day, Welt would travel with Himiko to New Mexico after hearing about an alien sighting. Eventually, Welt and Himiko would become good friends, and Welt would finally be introduced to Himiko's father, Ryusuke. He would then learn about his obsessions with space and aliens. Welt would dub his research non-dangerous. However, obsession is a powerful thing, seeing as he would sacrifice anything for the sake of his research, even ignoring his sick wife who would eventually pass away, all for the sake of his research. Certain events happen and Welt would have a confrontation with Ryusuke in space. Ryusuke would then crush and kill his alien companion to use his power to combat against Welt. And after a tough battle, Welt with no other choice decides to use the Star of Eden to create a black hole, killing Ryusuke. A bit later, during an expedition into a place called the Sea of Quanta, which is the empty space that sits between the world of the imaginary tree, Welt would fall into the Sea of Quanta where Einstein would lose communication with him. Welt stayed in the sea for some time until a girl named Bronya Zajic would eventually enter the sea in search for another girl named Sela. Bronya would, however, meet a boy named Joachim, who is actually Welt, while traversing the sea. Welt acted as the guardian of the sea to test Bronya. She eventually passes and Welt would then give Bronya the Herrscher of Reason's core, making her the third Herrscher of Reason. Bronya, Sela, and Welt would exit the Sea of Quantum, and Welt would become somewhat of a mentor to the new Herrscher of Reason and teach Bronya how to use her powers. Bronya would go on to perfect the core and become the Herrscher of Truth. After certain events, the crisis with the Honkai was finally resolved and Bronya would give the core back to Welt, and together would create a game development studio called Reason Studios. The year is now 2029, and the alien race known as the Sky People have decided to try and take over Earth. While they have been here since 2005, they have become more prevalent as of recent. And since the Honkai have been mostly eradicated from Earth, these aliens have become the biggest threat to the planet. Welt would also adopt one of Cocolia's clones of Welt Joyce, which he would go on to name Geoffrey Joyce Yang. Welt would also meet a man who calls himself Void Archives. If you recall, this was the name of Otto Apocalypse's power. The Void Archives is a divine key with its own AI. So, after Otto died, the Void Archives took one of Otto's clones and became its own entity. Being an AI, the Void Archives was programmed with the mission to eliminate all of the Honkai on Earth. However, the Void Archives also wants to protect the Earth from the Sky People, and would require the power of the Herrscher of Reason to do so. Welt would come along since the Void Archives threatened his family, and together would find the Sky People's spaceship. On this spaceship, Welt would find files on someone who looks to be Himiko. However, during this storyline, the Himiko of Honkai Impact 3rd was already dead. This would, of course, be Honkai Star Rail's Himiko. Void Archives explains that the Himiko isn't from their world, hence why the Sky People became interested in her. He would also say that these Sky People also plan on invading her world as well. Welt would then convince the Void Archives to go save this version of Himiko and her world. Welt and the Void Archives would eventually be rescued from the spaceship and then depart to the universe of Honkai Star Rail, where they would eventually be found by Himiko aboard the Astral Express. This is gonna be where Welt's story ends. This entire journey was honestly rather fun. Learning about Welt's story as I was writing this script was an experience I was glad to participate in. Welt is honestly an amazing character with such an interesting backstory. Having to go through multiple POVs just to get the entire picture is honestly something I haven't really experienced at all. And doing this video really solidified my love for this character. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more content like this, let me know down in the comments below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next Honkai Story video. Signing off.